The early morning sun filtered through the towering windows of the Washington, D.C. courthouse as Sarah Bennett adjusted her navy blazer and straightened her leather briefcase. At 52, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from 2 decades of teaching constitutional law at Georgetown University Law Center. Sarah had not planned to be in traffic court that Monday morning. Her research on racial disparities in the justice system usually kept her in libraries, behind computer screens, analyzing data and patterns. However, a recent surge in complaints about discriminatory traffic citations had drawn her from her comfortable office and into the courthouse's hard wooden benches. She had been following the stories, hearing about the frustration from communities who felt unfairly targeted, and it had sparked something in her to witness firsthand how the system was functioning. The courthouse was alive with its usual morning bustle. Security guards nodded at familiar faces, clerks shuffled papers, and nervous defendants whispered quietly to their lawyers. Sarah watched all of it with a keen eye, her notepad ready on her lap. Her pen moved swiftly, documenting the subtle interactions unfolding before her. She noted how some people were greeted with smiles, while others were met with curt nods, how certain defendants were interrupted mid-sentence, while others were given the time to explain themselves fully. It was a quiet yet powerful observation of the invisible biases that permeated the court system. Few in the room knew who she was. As one of Georgetown's most respected professors, Sarah had shaped the minds of countless legal professionals, including judges now presiding over cases in this very courtroom. Her articles on judicial bias were required reading in law schools across the country, and her expert testimony had influenced several landmark cases on racial discrimination. But today she sat quietly in the back row of the courtroom, dressed simply in her blazer and pencil skirt, blending in with the other professionals who might have been there for the same reason, a traffic citation. Sarah had received her own ticket for an alleged parking violation on K Street, a situation that had felt ambiguous from the start. The signage in the area had been unclear, and the officer who issued the ticket had been dismissive when she attempted to explain. While she had considered paying the fine online and moving on, something about the circumstances had prompted her to contest it. There was something about the way the system worked, or more accurately, didn't work, that felt too familiar to her research on racial disparities in the justice system. The decision to appear in court was a small one, but for Sarah, it felt necessary, a chance to see firsthand how things unfolded in a system she had studied for years. As the room gradually filled with people, young and old, professionally dressed and casual, Sarah noticed how people naturally segregated themselves, creating invisible lines of division. It was subtle but unmistakable. Some defendants gathered in groups, clustering together by age, gender, or race, while others stood apart, visibly anxious. Her trained eye caught how the anxiety manifested differently across faces. Some showed defiance, others resignation, and a few carried the confident ease of those familiar with the system. Sarah watched as the crowd shifted and murmured, but her mind stayed focused on the court and the biases that often went unnoticed by those on the bench. At precisely 9 a.m., the voice of the bailiff rang out, commanding everyone to rise. Sarah stood with the others, her posture straight but relaxed. She watched as Judge Michael Harrison entered the courtroom. His black robes flowed behind him, and there was a noticeable confidence in his stride. He was known for being particularly strict with traffic violations, especially in cases involving minority defendants. What Judge Harrison couldn't know was that among the people he was about to pass judgment on that day was Sarah Bennett, the very professor who had not only taught him constitutional law but had also written one of his recommendations for judicial appointment. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she observed his confident walk to the bench. She remembered him as an eager student, always the first to raise his hand, passionate about justice but at times blind to his own preconceptions. It had been years since she had taught him, and now here he was, sitting on the bench, presiding over cases with a sense of authority. As the proceedings began and cases were called one by one, Sarah continued her careful observations. She documented each interaction, each decision, each subtle shift in tone as the cases progressed. Sarah knew that sometimes the most powerful lessons about justice didn't come from textbooks or lectures. They came from real-life experiences, moments when people were forced to confront their own biases, often without even realizing they had them. She understood the nuances of courtroom behavior, how judges, lawyers, and defendants all carried with them their own prejudices, whether conscious or unconscious. Today she was not only a witness to these cases but also an observer of the very systems she had spent years researching. Meanwhile, Judge Harrison sat in his chambers reviewing the day's docket. At 35 he was one of the youngest judges appointed to the D.C. Traffic Court, and he took immense pride in maintaining strict order in his courtroom. The morning sunlight cast shadows across the polished mahogany of his desk as he sipped his black coffee. His clerk had already arranged the day's cases into neat stacks: parking violations, speeding tickets, and other minor infractions that most of his colleagues considered mundane. But Harrison approached each case with a sense of purpose, seeing each one not just as a matter of law but as a test of fairness, integrity, and justice. He prided himself on running a tight courtroom, rarely letting anything slip past him without scrutiny. He often relied on the law to guide him, but even with his self-assurance he didn't always see the bigger picture, the impact his decisions had on the lives of the defendants in front of him. What Harrison didn't yet understand was that today, as he presided over these cases, he was about to learn a powerful lesson in justice, humility, and the persistent challenge of unconscious bias. It was a lesson that would not come from textbooks or lectures, but from Sarah Bennett, a quiet observer in the back row, and from the very system he worked to uphold. This Monday morning, it seemed, was destined to become an extraordinary moment in the ongoing struggle for fairness and equity in the American legal system. Judge Michael Harrison was known for his strict adherence to the law, no matter how small the violation. His reputation preceded him through the courthouse hallways, where defense attorneys would often warn their clients about his no-nonsense approach. Even veteran lawyers could be seen straightening their ties a little tighter before entering his courtroom. Some whispered that Harrison was trying to prove himself due to his youth, while others suggested he was building a record to secure higher judicial appointments. Regardless of the gossip, one thing was clear: Harrison took his job seriously, and his focus on maintaining control in the courtroom was unwavering. Today's docket appeared typical: 27 cases, mostly traffic violations. Harrison skimmed through them, mentally noting the details. His eyes paused briefly on a parking citation issued on K Street, the defendant's name catching his attention: Sarah Bennett. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he dismissed the thought. After handling thousands of cases, names often blurred together. He continued reviewing the rest of the docket, making mental notes as he prepared for the day ahead. As he donned his black robes, Harrison's mind drifted back to his law school days at Georgetown University. Those halls had shaped him, molding his understanding of justice and law. He remembered passionate discussions about constitutional rights, fairness, and equality. Yet now, as a judge in traffic court, he had found his own interpretation of justice: swift, strict, and unwavering. In his view, the law was simple: guilty or not guilty, pay the fine or face the consequences. The bailiff knocked on his door, signaling that it was time for him to enter the courtroom. Harrison gathered his papers, straightened his spine, and took a deep breath, checking his reflection in the mirror. His young face was set in serious lines, his dark hair neatly combed, and his robes perfectly arranged. He looked the part of judicial authority, a role he had worked hard to cultivate. With one last glance at his reflection, he walked through the private corridor to the courtroom, reviewing his personal rules as he went. Maintain control, show no favoritism, and always uphold the letter of the law. These principles had served him well in his first year on the bench, earning him respect, if not popularity. As he entered the courtroom, his mind briefly wandered to his old constitutional law professor, whose lessons about justice and equality had once seemed so clear. Now, in the daily grind of traffic court, justice seemed simpler, black and white. He had become accustomed to dispensing judgments quickly, based on the evidence in front of him and the rules of the law. He was focused on efficiency and maintaining order, not on the nuanced issues of fairness he had once studied in law school. Little did he know, this ordinary Monday would challenge everything he thought he knew about judgment and fairness. All rise, the bailiff's voice rang out, signaling the start of the session. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom, his expression stern and confident. He took his seat at the bench, completely unaware that among the faces before him was one that would soon remind him of lessons he had long forgotten. As the morning proceeded with his usual efficiency, Harrison called each case one by one. The room was filled with the familiar shuffle of defendants stepping forward, lawyers making their arguments, and the occasional murmur of the crowd. Harrison's focus remained sharp, his decisions quick and final. However, when case number 47 was called, Sarah Bennett, parking violation on K Street, the proceedings were about to take an unexpected turn. Sarah Bennett, parking violation on K Street, the clerk called out, her voice echoing through the crowded courtroom. Sarah rose gracefully from her seat, her movements deliberate and dignified as she approached the podium. Several attorneys present noticed something different about her demeanor. She did not carry the typical nervousness of a defendant. Instead, she exuded the confident bearing of someone intimately familiar with courtroom proceedings. This was not her first time in court, and it was clear she knew how to navigate the system. Judge Harrison barely glanced up from his papers as Sarah approached, his voice carrying the same stern tone he used with every defendant. "Miss Bennett, you're charged with parking in a restricted zone during rush hour. How do you plead?" he asked, his tone detached and authoritative. Sarah's voice was clear and measured as she responded, "Not guilty, Your Honor." She began to explain the circumstances, describing the obscured signage and the confusing parking regulations that had led her to park in the restricted zone without realizing the time restrictions. However, before she could finish her sentence, Harrison interrupted her abruptly, cutting her off mid-explanation. "Miss Bennett," he said, his tone growing noticeably impatient, "the officer's report clearly states that you were parked in a clearly marked restricted zone between 4 o'clock and 6 p.m. Are you suggesting the officer was incorrect?" His words were sharp, and his voice carried a sense of finality, as though the case had already been decided in his mind. A few regular attorneys in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably at his tone. They exchanged glances, noting how Harrison's interruption seemed particularly abrupt this time. It was unusual for him to cut off a defendant so quickly, especially in a case where the facts had yet to be fully presented. But Sarah, unfazed by his tone, remained calm and composed. She stood tall and met his gaze, her voice steady as she responded. "Your Honor, if I may," she continued, her tone measured but firm, "I have photographs showing that the sign in question was partially covered by overgrown branches, making it impossible to read the restriction times from the angle of approach." She held up the photos as evidence, clearly prepared to make her case. Harrison's expression hardened as he glanced at the photographs, but he remained silent for a moment. The courtroom was still, the tension palpable. For the first time that morning, Harrison's usual confidence wavered as he considered Sarah's evidence. His mind raced. Was it possible that he had missed something? Had he been too quick to judge? This small moment, this seemingly routine traffic case, was forcing him to confront the biases he hadn't even realized he was carrying. The simple black and white world of traffic court was about to become far more complicated than he had anticipated. Judge Michael Harrison had heard every excuse in the book, and Sarah Bennett's explanation, though polite and composed, didn't seem any different from the others. He had dealt with countless cases like this one, each revolving around parking violations, and his decision was already set in his mind before Sarah could finish speaking. He wasn't prepared to be swayed by her calm demeanor or the photographs she had presented. "Miss Bennett," he said sharply, his voice carrying the practiced authority he had honed over the past year, "this court's time is valuable." He glanced down at the officer's report, which clearly indicated no obstruction in the restricted parking zone. His tone became dismissive as he continued. "The officer's report indicates no such obstruction." Sarah reached into her briefcase to retrieve the photographs that might prove her case, but Harrison waved his hand in a clear dismissal. "That won't be necessary," he said, cutting her off. His eyes returned to the report, already making up his mind. The burden of knowing and following parking regulations falls on the driver, not the city. Despite his growing impatience, Sarah remained composed. Her calmness in the face of Harrison's clear irritation was striking. She stood tall, maintaining eye contact, and responded with the kind of practiced patience that suggested she had faced far more challenging interactions than this one. Sarah was no stranger to the courtroom, nor was she unfamiliar with judicial attitudes that sometimes didn't fully account for the complexities of fairness and justice. She was a professor of constitutional law, after all, and had spent years teaching others about the very principles that Harrison seemed to be overlooking in this case. She knew the power of a calm and measured response in the face of authority and was determined not to allow Harrison's dismissive tone to sway her. As their exchange continued, a noticeable shift occurred in the room. The usual rhythm of the court's proceedings faltered. The tension in the air grew palpable. Even the regular court officers, those who had witnessed countless cases, shifted uncomfortably at their posts, sensing that something was different here. The other defendants in the room, waiting for their turn, seemed to pick up on this shift as well. They watched with growing interest as the exchange between Sarah and the judge unfolded, feeling that this case was not like the others they had seen that morning. There was a quiet anticipation in the room, as if everyone knew that this seemingly routine traffic violation had become something far more significant. But Judge Harrison, unaware of the effect this interaction was having, leaned forward in his chair, his decision already formed. He had made up his mind, and no amount of evidence or measured explanation was going to change it. His face was set in stern lines, his expression unyielding. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across his features as he prepared to deliver his verdict. "Miss Bennett," he announced in his usual no-nonsense tone, "this court finds you guilty of violating City Parking Code 23.4. His words were final, carrying the weight of someone who felt confident in their judgment. "Given your apparent disregard for clearly posted regulations and your attempts to dispute the officer's professional judgment, I'm setting the fine at $500. The words rang out in the courtroom and a collective murmur rippled through the room. Even the regular attorneys present exchanged surprised glances. This was an unusually severe fine for what was, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively minor infraction. Parking violations rarely resulted in such steep penalties, but here Harrison had set the fine at 5 times the usual amount. A few of the more experienced attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the disproportionate nature of the penalty. They were used to judges making decisions based on the letter of the law, but this felt different. Something about the fine felt punitive in a way that suggested more than just a simple application of the law. It felt personal, almost as if Harrison were sending a message. Sarah, however, stood motionless at the podium, her expression unchanged. She listened to Harrison's pronouncement without flinching, her demeanor calm, almost detached. She showed no sign of anger or frustration, emotions that might have been expected from someone facing such an unexpectedly harsh penalty. Instead, there was something in the way she held herself, an air of quiet confidence, as if she knew this story was far from over. As Harrison finished scribbling the fine amount on the citation, he continued, his tone growing even more severe. "Furthermore," he said, "I want to note for the record that this court takes a dim view of citizens who attempt to circumvent their responsibility by questioning the competence of our law enforcement officers." His words carried an edge, and there was no mistaking the implication, that Sarah's challenge to the officer's judgment had been an affront to the system. The court clerk was already typing furiously, documenting every word, but the usual sense of routine had gone out of the window. This wasn't a simple traffic case anymore, it had become something more complicated. For those familiar with the courtroom, it was a rare sight to see such a severe penalty for a parking violation. The regular attorneys and observers had never seen a fine set so high, especially not for something as minor as a parking ticket. Some began taking notes, sensing that this case might become a reference point in future discussions about judicial behavior and fairness. Others looked at Sarah, wondering what she would do next. Finally, Sarah spoke. Her voice was as calm and measured as ever, even in the face of such a harsh ruling. "Your Honor, I accept the court's decision," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had anticipated this outcome. She paused for a moment, adjusting her glasses deliberately, then continued, "However, I should mention that this will unfortunately require me to end my constitutional law lecture early this afternoon." Judge Harrison barely looked up from his paperwork. His pen moved quickly as he jotted down his final notes on the case. "Miss Bennett," he said, his tone flat, "your scheduling conflicts are not this court's concern. You should have considered your professional obligations before violating city parking ordinances." His words were dismissive, as if to say that he had already dismissed her claims, her arguments, and her presence in his courtroom. The room fell unusually quiet after that, the tension lingering in the air. Even the bailiff, who had seen countless cases before, seemed to sense that something significant was unfolding. The courtroom, bathed in the harsh light of the morning sun, became a stage for a much larger drama than Harrison could have anticipated. Sarah gathered her materials slowly, unhurriedly, as if each movement were deliberate and composed. She showed no outward sign of the anger or frustration that typically accompanied such a harsh penalty. Instead, her calmness seemed to speak volumes. There was a quiet strength in the way she moved, as though she had already accepted the injustice of the situation. But she knew, deep down, that this moment was far from over. As Sarah returned to her seat, the tension in the room remained palpable. The next case had already been called, but several eyes remained fixed on her. They watched as she took her seat, her calmness in stark contrast to the charged atmosphere that surrounded her. And though Judge Harrison had already moved on to the next case, he had no idea that the decision he had just made would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice and fairness. What seemed like a routine traffic violation was, in fact, the beginning of a much larger reckoning, one that would force Harrison to confront his own biases and assumptions about the law. The ripple effects of this moment would soon be felt far beyond the walls of that courtroom. The courtroom had fallen into complete silence, the kind of hush that only comes with an unexpected, earth-shattering revelation. Sarah Bennett's voice, measured and calm, broke the tension. "I do need to finish grading papers for tomorrow's advanced seminar at Georgetown Law," she said, her words carrying an unexpected weight. You remember those deadlines well, don't you, Judge Harrison? From when you were in my constitutional law class, 10 years ago? The effect was immediate and profound. Judge Harrison's hand froze mid-scribble, his pen hovering in the air as if time had suddenly stopped. His face, once composed and authoritative, visibly paled. The revelation hit him like a physical blow, like a gut punch, as memories from a decade ago flooded back all at once. Had just been in the middle of presiding over a routine parking violation case, his usual stern demeanor in full force, but in that moment he saw Sarah Bennett not as a defendant, but as his professor, the one who had shaped his very understanding of law and justice. Several attorneys in the gallery gasped audibly, the sound cutting through the stillness. The court clerk's fingers hovered motionless over her keyboard, unable to continue typing as the room remained frozen. Even the bailiff, who was known for his stoic demeanor, seemed to falter, unable to maintain his usual composure. It wasn't just the revelation that Sarah Bennett, one of the most respected constitutional law professors in the country, was the woman standing before him, it was the deeper realization of what that moment meant. Judge Harrison slowly raised his head, his gaze now locking with Sarah's. He truly saw her for the first time that morning. She stood there, exactly as he remembered her from his law school days, authoritative, confident, and unwavering in her pursuit of justice. It wasn't just the face of a professor he saw, it was a reminder of all the lessons she had imparted on him about the law, about fairness, and about the deep importance of self-awareness in the judicial process. It was as if the very principles she had taught him in that classroom were now being thrown back in his face, a sharp contrast to the way he had conducted himself in her presence today. The irony was staggering. Sarah Bennett, who had once written one of his strongest letters of recommendation for judicial appointment, was now standing before him, witnessing firsthand how far he had strayed from the very principles she had helped instill in him. She had praised his understanding of equal justice under the law, and now he had just provided a textbook example of exactly the kind of biased judgment she had warned him about. Memories came rushing back to him in a tidal wave, her passionate lectures on judicial temperament, the way she had emphasized the subtle ways bias could creep into decision-making, and her insistence that each case be treated with equal consideration, regardless of the defendant's background. All of this came flooding back to him in that moment of recognition. Judge Harrison, the confident young judge who prided himself on being strict and unwavering, was now painfully aware of just how much he had failed to live up to the ideals that Sarah had worked so hard to instill in him. His face flushed red with embarrassment, the harsh judgment he had delivered now feeling like a cruel joke. He had acted impulsively, dismissing Sarah's evidence without a second thought, interrupting her more aggressively than he had any other defendant that day. He had imposed a fine that was far beyond the usual amount, and all of this had been done without once truly looking at the person standing before him. He had been so wrapped up in his own sense of authority that he hadn't even noticed the deeper, more troubling dynamics at play. The young, eager law student he had once been, full of passion and questions about fairness, had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by a judge who had become too caught up in the daily grind of the system to remember the lessons he had once learned. The weight of that realization hit him like a ton of bricks. His earlier smugness, his unshakable confidence that he was simply enforcing the law, vanished in an instant. He had become exactly the kind of judge Sarah had warned him about, the kind who allowed unconscious bias to shape his decisions, the kind who lost sight of the deeper truths about justice. His earlier self-assuredness evaporated, replaced by a crushing sense of self-doubt. The silence in the courtroom stretched on, longer than anyone could have anticipated. It felt like an eternity, the kind of pause that seems to capture the entire weight of a moment. The room was still, the only sound the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above and the soft shuffle of papers. Everyone in the courtroom, from the regular attorneys to the defendants, seemed to sense that something extraordinary was happening, something far beyond the typical proceedings of a traffic court. Sarah stood there, silent and composed, her expression neither triumphant nor accusatory. She wasn't seeking to rub his mistake in his face, instead she was giving him space to confront it on his own. In that moment she remained the teacher not just to him but to everyone present in the room. The lesson was not one he had anticipated, but it was an important one. Judge Harrison looked down at the excessive fine he had just imposed, his eyes lingering on the absurdity of the amount. It was a decision that, in hindsight, seemed so out of proportion, so clearly influenced by something other than a fair application of the law. He looked up at Sarah, and in that moment, all of the arrogance and confidence that had defined him up until now seemed to drain from his face. The young judge who had prided himself on being fair and strict now realized that, in fact, he had become something else entirely. The weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure of the very principles he had spent years learning and, at one point, even teaching. It was a stark reminder of how easily bias could creep into decisions, how the rush of authority could blind someone to the humanity of those standing before them. And in this case, that person was Sarah Bennett, the professor who had shaped his understanding of justice. After what felt like an eternity, Judge Harrison finally broke the silence. His voice was shaky as he called for a 10-minute recess. 10-minute recess, he announced abruptly, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to regain his composure. The sound of the gavel striking the wood echoed through the room, but it didn't provide the usual sense of finality. It felt like a temporary escape, a retreat from the uncomfortable reality he now faced. Without looking anyone in the eye, Harrison quickly exited the courtroom and retreated to his chambers. His black robes billowed behind him as he walked briskly, his mind still reeling from the confrontation. Inside his chambers, he collapsed into his leather chair, his hands trembling as he loosened his collar. He pulled out an old Georgetown law yearbook from his bottom drawer, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the pages. There she was, Sarah Bennett, smiling proudly, her photo captured during his graduating year. She stood among the constitutional law faculty, a symbol of everything he had once aspired to be. The memories rushed back, her passionate lectures on equal justice, her patient guidance during office hours, and the glowing letter of recommendation she had written for him. That letter had helped launch his judicial career, and now it felt like a cruel irony. The words she had written, so full of praise, now seemed to mock him as he sat in his chambers, confronting the truth of how far he had fallen from the ideals she had taught him. As the minutes ticked by, Harrison replayed the morning's proceedings in his mind. The interruptions. The dismissal of Sarah's evidence. The fine. Everything that had felt so justified in the moment now seemed like an embarrassing misstep. He had been so focused on maintaining his authority that he had completely missed the deeper lesson, the one that Sarah had been quietly teaching him all along. A soft knock on the door broke his thoughts. The recess was nearly over. Harrison stood up before his mirror, his gaze fixed on the reflection before him. He didn't recognize the man staring back at him. The young judge who had prided himself on being strict but fair now looked like someone who had lost sight of the very principles that had once driven him. He felt small, humbled, and more than a little ashamed. Outside his chambers, the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Everyone seemed to be aware that something extraordinary had just happened, even if they didn't fully understand what it meant. Harrison knew, though. And in that moment he knew his work was far from over. Attorneys who regularly appeared before Judge Harrison exchanged knowing looks, their curiosity piqued by the events that had just unfolded in the courtroom. They wondered how this revelation, the one that had shifted the very foundation of the young judge's perception of fairness, would affect the future of his judicial career. For many of them, Harrison had been a fixture in the courthouse, known for his stern demeanor and unwavering commitment to enforcing the law with a firm hand. They had seen him make decisions that seemed decisive, but this moment, this transformation, was unlike anything they had witnessed before. The question now was how it would change him, and more importantly, how it would change the way he interacted with those who appeared before him. Sarah, on the other hand, remained composed in her seat, quietly grading papers. She seemed unaffected by the drama unfolding around her, her demeanor calm and measured as if this were just another day in her decades-long career of teaching justice to future legal professionals. There was no self-congratulation, no sense of vindication in her posture or her expression. It was as if she had always known that this moment could come, that the principles of fairness she had taught for so long would eventually become more than just theoretical concepts in a classroom. She hadn't come seeking confrontation. Rather, she had simply allowed the moment to unfold in a way that turned it into a profound teaching opportunity, not just for Judge Harrison but for everyone present. As Harrison gathered his composure, he took several deep breaths and straightened his robes. He knew that the next few minutes would define not just this case, but potentially the course of his entire judicial career. The young judge who had once walked into the courtroom with unshakable confidence, prepared to assert his authority over every case, now felt a sense of humility and uncertainty. His decision to right his wrongs had come suddenly, but with it came a realization that he could no longer act as though his power on the bench was an invincible force. Justice, after all, was not about power, it was about fairness, equality, and humility. Judge Harrison returned to the courtroom with a markedly different demeanor. His stride, once confident and brisk, had become more measured, almost hesitant. His expression, which had been so stern earlier in the day, now carried a contemplative quality, as though he were deeply reflecting on the weight of his actions. His voice, when he addressed the room, carried an unexpected humility that caught everyone off guard. "Professor Bennett," he began, his tone respectful and solemn, "I owe you and this court an apology. My conduct this morning failed to meet the very standards of justice you taught me a decade ago." His words hung in the air, and for a moment the room was still. This was unprecedented. Judges rarely admitted fault, and it was even rarer for them to publicly acknowledge their biases and mistakes, especially in the midst of a courtroom session. But there was no trace of defensiveness in Harrison's tone. He spoke with a genuine sense of remorse. "I've allowed my position to blind me to my own biases," he continued. "Today you've given all of us, a powerful reminder about the importance of fair and equal treatment under the law." The courtroom remained silent as Harrison picked up Sarah's citation from the podium, the paper that had sparked this entire moment of introspection. "I'm resigning the $500 fine," he announced. His words were firm but free of the earlier arrogance that had colored his voice. "Furthermore, I'm dismissing this case entirely due to the unclear signage you attempted to bring to the court's attention." The audience shifted in their seats, murmurs of surprise rippling through the room. Sarah, ever composed, nodded graciously, accepting the apology without further comment. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished yet. The apology was more than just about correcting a specific mistake. It was about reaffirming his commitment to the ideals that he had learned, but had momentarily forgotten. "Professor Bennett," he continued, his voice carrying an even deeper sense of sincerity, "your lessons about constitutional rights and equal justice weren't just classroom theory. They were principles I swore to uphold when I became a judge. And today I failed to live up to those principles." He turned to address the entire courtroom, his gaze sweeping over the room. "Let this be a reminder to everyone present, myself especially, that justice must be blind to prejudice and not to reason. Our duty is to hear each case with fresh ears and see each person before us with clear eyes." The room fell silent again, this time in a different way. The regular attorneys exchanged impressed glances, some even scribbling down notes as they recognized that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just an apology, it was a public acknowledgement of the kind of bias that, while often subtle, had the potential to shape the outcome of cases in ways that contradicted the very principles of justice. For the first time, a judge had admitted to his flaws, to the ways in which his own biases had influenced his decisions. And in doing so he had corrected his error, not just for the sake of one defendant, but for the sake of the entire legal system. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, sensing that this moment was a significant one. Sarah, ever the teacher, spoke next. Her voice was gentle, but there was an authority in it that spoke volumes about her years of experience in legal education. "Thank you, Judge Harrison," she said, her tone carrying the same educational weight she had used in countless lectures. "This moment demonstrates why our legal system depends not just on rules, but on the humility and wisdom of those who interpret them." The transformation in the courtroom was palpable. What had started as a routine traffic court session, filled with minor infractions and standard legal procedures, had become something far more meaningful. It was a profound lesson in justice, humility, and the ongoing struggle against unconscious bias. The remaining defendants and attorneys watched as Harrison continued the day's proceedings with a noticeably different approach. He was more patient, more attentive, and more balanced in his considerations. His decisions now carried a sense of genuine reflection, as though he was determined not to let bias cloud his judgment again. 3 months later, Georgetown Law School's main auditorium was filled to capacity. Judge Michael Harrison stood at the podium, flanked by Professor Sarah Bennett, addressing a captivated audience of law students, faculty, and legal professionals. The event was a special lecture, a chance to reflect on the lessons that had been learned from the courtroom incident that had so profoundly altered Harrison's approach to the law. "What happened that day in traffic court," Harrison explained, "wasn't just about a parking ticket. It was about recognizing how easily our biases can cloud our judgment, even when we believe we're being fair." The case had become a powerful teaching tool at Georgetown Law, with Professor Bennett incorporating it into her curriculum to demonstrate how unconscious bias could manifest, even in minor legal proceedings. The story of Harrison's public self-correction had spread far beyond Georgetown, making its way into legal journals and judicial training programs across the country. In the months following the incident, regular attorneys who had once seen Harrison as a strict, no-nonsense judge now noted a marked difference in his approach. Every case he handled was given careful consideration, regardless of the defendant's appearance or background. His reputation shifted from being known as the strictest judge on the bench to being recognized as one of the most fair-minded. Professor Bennett, inspired by the transformation she had witnessed, turned the experience into a groundbreaking research paper titled Justice in the Mirror, Examining Judicial Bias in Minor Courts. The paper was already influencing judicial training programs nationwide, shaping the way that future judges would be taught to recognize and guard against bias in all forms. During a special address, Professor Bennett reflected on the experience. "Sometimes," she said, "the most important lessons about justice come from the most unexpected moments. What matters isn't that we make mistakes, but how we respond to them." The incident in Judge Harrison's courtroom had not only caused a personal awakening but had sparked a broader conversation within the DC court system. After that fateful morning, other judges began reflecting on their own decision-making patterns. They started scrutinizing their judgments with a newfound awareness of the potential biases that could shape their rulings. This self-reflection led to the development of new guidelines for handling traffic court cases, aimed at ensuring fairness and consistency in sentencing. Judges, now more conscious of their biases, began to implement more uniform procedures, aiming to reduce any discrepancies in how defendants from different backgrounds were treated. As the weeks passed, statistical analysis confirmed the positive effects of these changes. There was a notable reduction in disparate sentencing across demographic groups, showing that Harrison's public admission had not only altered his own approach but had reverberated through the court system. The shift was tangible, and many credited the incident with raising awareness about the subtle ways bias could infiltrate judicial decisions, even in seemingly minor cases like parking violations. When the lecture series at Georgetown Law finally concluded, a student in the audience asked Judge Harrison what he had learned most from his transformative experience. Harrison paused, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, as he reflected on the question. His voice, steady and thoughtful, carried across the auditorium as he spoke. "Justice isn't just about knowing the law," he began. "It's about remaining humble enough to recognize our own prejudices and brave enough to correct them." His words struck a chord with the audience, who were now more attuned than ever to the complexities of justice, especially the unspoken biases that could cloud one's judgment. The case had become known among law students as the professor's lesson, a powerful reminder that true justice requires constant self-examination and the courage to admit when we've fallen short of our ideals. The story of Judge Harrison's transformation spread like wildfire across legal circles, serving as a case study for how even the most well-intentioned individuals could make mistakes, but more importantly, how those mistakes could be rectified with integrity. The event had rippled out of Georgetown's walls, becoming a symbol of judicial growth and accountability. In the weeks following the incident, Harrison's colleagues in the courthouse began quietly discussing his actions and the lessons that had followed. Some attorneys who had once viewed Harrison as a strict and uncompromising judge now spoke of him with newfound respect, admiring his ability to self-correct and take responsibility. The courtroom, once filled with tension and an almost tangible expectation of harsh sentences, had become a place where fairness and reflection were now at the forefront. Judge Harrison had transformed from a figure of rigid authority into one who was willing to examine his own role in perpetuating the systemic inequalities that had long plagued the legal system. However, while the broader legal community was coming to terms with the shift, the moment was far from over for Harrison. The emotional toll of what had transpired continued to weigh heavily on him. His thoughts returned to the courtroom that day, where he had failed to properly acknowledge the evidence Sarah Bennett had presented. The fine he had imposed, 5 times the standard amount, now seemed not only excessive but emblematic of the very biases he had been trained to guard against. In his chambers, his hands trembled as he recalled the sharp way he had dismissed her evidence and interrupted her. He had done so without truly listening to her, without even seeing her face. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The man who had once prided himself on his commitment to justice and impartiality had, in fact, made a mockery of those principles in front of someone who had helped shape his understanding of them. Sarah Bennett, the professor who had challenged him to think critically about the law and the biases inherent within it, had now become the embodiment of everything he had failed to live up to. He had not just made a poor decision. He had become a case study in the very biases she had warned them about in her lectures. The weight of his shame was crushing, and he could feel the heat of embarrassment rising in his chest as he replayed the morning's events in his mind. He had been too quick to judge, too eager to assert his authority without considering the full scope of the situation. How many times had Sarah spoken about the importance of judicial temperament, of the need to keep one's emotions in check and treat every defendant with fairness and respect, regardless of their appearance or background. How many times had she warned them about the insidious ways in which unconscious bias could shape decision-making? Harrison had ignored it all. His own actions had contradicted every lesson she had tried to impart. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, whispers had begun circulating through the gallery. Attorneys who regularly appeared before Harrison exchanged knowing glances, sensing that something had shifted. Even the court officers, usually unflappable in the face of all manner of proceedings, seemed to be unable to hide their newfound respect for Professor Bennett. She had become something of a legend in the room, not just for her role as a teacher but for the way she had used this moment to expose the flaws in the system, flaws that no one else had been willing to acknowledge. Sarah remained calm, grading papers as if this were just another teachable moment. Her demeanor made the situation all the more poignant, as if she were saying without words, that this was the very lesson she had tried to impart for years. She hadn't come to the courtroom seeking confrontation or drama, but simply to ensure that justice would be served. And in doing so, she had managed to turn a seemingly routine case into a profound lesson for all those present. As the recess came to an end, Harrison found himself standing in front of his mirror, looking at the man he had become. The young judge who had prided himself on being strict but fair now looked back at him as a man who had lost sight of the fundamental principles he had been taught. The weight of his own actions pressed heavily on him as he prepared to return to the courtroom. He knew that the next few minutes would define not just this case but possibly the rest of his career. He thought about Sarah and what she would expect from him now. No excuses. No defensiveness. Just honesty, self-reflection, and the courage to correct his mistakes. This was not a moment for pride or justification. It was a moment for action. The lessons she had taught him so many years ago were now being tested in the most profound way. The knock on his door was more insistent now. The recess was ending and he had to make a decision. The time for self-doubt was over. Harrison squared his shoulders, took one last deep breath, and prepared to face the truth about himself, his actions, and the future of his role in the justice system.